We're going to get on with the talk. Here at Seattle Atheist Church, the members ourselves give many of the talks. We have a planning meeting every quarter that's open to the whole community to brainstorm ideas. Today, I hope you will join me in welcoming Jack, who's going to be giving a talk on how to combat people's racial bias according to science.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Ruth. Thank you all for coming today. Let me share my screen here. I'm going to talk to you today about how to combat people's racial bias according to science. As some of you know, we're hosting a book club that's currently reading Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. My first encounter with Kendi and his work was on an episode of the Ezra Klein podcast, where Klein asked Kendi to elaborate about a line he found particularly intriguing. At a time when I thought I was the most radical, I was the most conservative. Kendi explained that as he was describing a plan for a protest that he was presenting to the Black Student Union, he recalled that someone in the attendance rebutted with a look of fear, "This is illegal. They'll throw us in prison." He continued on, quote, "hardly caring that the more I spoke, the more fear I spread. The more fear I spread, the more I alienated people from the campaign. When I lashed out at well-meaning people who showed the normal impulse of fear, who used the incorrect racial terminology, who asked the incorrect question, oh, did I think I was so radical? When my scorched earth words sent attendees fleeing at BSU rallies and meetings, when my scorched earth writings sent readers fleeing, oh, did I think I was so radical? But in fact, if all my words were doing was sounding radical, then those words were not radical at all. What if we measure the radicalism of speech by how radically it transforms open-minded people, by how much the speech liberates the anti-racist power within? What if we measure the conservatism of speech by how intensely it keeps people the same, keeps people enslaved by their racist ideas and fears, conserving their inequitable society? At a time when I thought I was the most radical, I was the most conservative." End quote. These are the words of someone who takes seriously the notion that intent doesn't matter, only impact matters. A while back, I was reading a brilliant article by Tim Urban on Wait But Why that cleverly illustrates many facets of our society's political disagreements. It's super long, but set aside some time to read through it. It's definitely worth it. One conceptual framework that I found particularly enlightening is this. It seems that all political disagreements can be categorized into one of three buckets: what is, what should be, and how to get there. Very briefly, what is the domain of science and history. What should be is the domain of philosophy and ethics. And how to get there is a matter of strategizing and experimentation. This made me think of a few ways we can go wrong, even if we all agree on what should be. For example, if we think what is one thing, and then we figure out the most effective plan for how to get there, but what is turns out to be pretty different than what we thought, then our plan isn't going to get us to where we want to go. Similarly, if we're right about what is, but the plan we came up with has effects that are pretty different from what we thought, then again, our plan isn't going to get us to where we want to go. It's even possible that our plan might get us very far away indeed from where we want to go, to a place where there is much weeping and gnashing of teeth. To help us navigate this world more effectively, the rationalists use the metaphor of the map and the territory to illustrate the differences between belief and reality. Our mental model of the world is like a map of reality. Reality is the territory as it exists out there in the world, which is far too complex for us to hold every detail in our brains. The metaphor is useful for illustrating several ideas in a more intuitive way. For example, scribbling on the map does not change the territory. The strategy that normally gives the most control over reality is one where the map is aligned to match the territory as closely as possible. This way, you can create accurate models and predict what will happen as a consequence of your actions. Humans are wired to sometimes let their beliefs slip into what they would like to believe instead of what the evidence suggests. This is like erasing a mountain off a map because you would like to pass there, or drawing an oasis on the map of a desert because you would like some water. The Stoics give us another metaphor: the dog leashed to the cart. Imagine a dog leashed to a moving cart. The leash is long enough that the dog has two options. One, either it can smoothly follow the direction of the cart over which it has no control, and at the same time enjoy the ride and explore the surroundings. Or two, it can stubbornly resist the cart with all its force and end up being dragged for the rest of the trip anyway. We are that dog, and the cart is reality. It's our choice whether we work with reality or whether we waste our time and energy trying to fight against it. How many of you have heard this claim before? That you can't make racist people less racist? I certainly have. I've heard it several times in the past few weeks, in fact. Maybe you've heard it in this form: that racists will always find some excuse to keep being racist. The problem is, this is not what the evidence suggests. In other words, this map doesn't match the territory particularly well. Daryl Davis is one high-profile counterexample. Over the course of 30 plus years, he's been able to convince over 200 KKK members to give up their robes. Dia Khan is another counterexample, though perhaps less well known. I first heard about her on Sam Harris's podcast. Her story is amazing. Be sure to have a look if you're interested. According to the Times of London, Khan uses hard and soft skills to discover what drives such hatred and forces people to face her, their so-called enemy. It gets under their skin and yields results. That brings us to the main feature I wanted to highlight today. An article in Vox, written in the aftermath of the disastrous election of 2016, by Herman Lopez, called "Research Says There Are Ways to Reduce Racial Bias. Calling People Racist Isn't One of Them. The challenge for anti-racists looking for solutions in Trump's America." Feel free to follow along in the article if you like. If you do, you'll notice I skip some content for time. In particular, I skip a couple of extended block quotes from Robin DiAngelo's work, because I expect most folks interested in this topic to have encountered those already. In 2016, researchers stumbled on a radical tactic for reducing another person's bigotry: frank, brief conversation. The study, authored by David Brookman at Stanford University and Joshua Kalla at the University of California, Berkeley, looked at how simple conversations can help combat anti-transgender attitudes. In the research, people canvassed the homes of more than 500 voters in South Florida. The canvassers, who could be trans or not, asked the voters to simply put themselves in the shoes of trans people to understand their problems through a 10-minute, non-confrontational conversation. The hope was that the brief discussion could lead people to reevaluate their biases. It worked. The trial found not only that voters' anti-trans attitudes declined, but that they remained lower 3 months later, showing an enduring result. And these voters' support for laws that protect trans people from discrimination increased, even when they were presented with counterarguments for such laws. I've been thinking a lot about this research since Election Day. After Donald Trump's victory in 2016, it's clear that the prejudiced views of a lot of Americans helped elect to the White House a man who's repeatedly made racist, offensive statements. Not only did Trump build his campaign largely on the fears of immigrants and Muslims, but based on a lot of polls and surveys. He also attracted the voters who reported by far the highest levels of racial resentment and their other prejudiced views. But just noting these racial attitudes and biases did not seem to have a huge impact on the election, despite bigoted policy proposals that at one point even called for banning an entire religious group from the US, and the media's constant reminders that Trump is racist. Trump won. Clearly, a lot of US voters either shared Trump's prejudiced views, or at the very least, didn't find such ideas to be fundamental deal breakers. So, how can we reduce this type of prejudice? The canvassing study provides a model for anti-trans attitudes, but can it be applied to other kinds of bigotry, such as racism, that might be more entrenched in the US? And even if we do embrace the canvassing model or something similar, how can we ensure that the conversations don't lead to a backlash, the kind of defensive posturing and denial of racism that might lead even more people to support candidates like Trump? In talking with researchers and looking at the studies on this in 2016, I found that it is possible to reduce people's racial anxiety and prejudices. And the canvassing idea was regarded as very promising. But, researchers cautioned, the process of reducing people's racism will take time and, crucially, empathy. This speaks to the point Margaret Renkel made in the New York Times. Quote, "If you are a white liberal whose goal is to foster a more equitable culture, you need to stop yelling racist at anyone who doesn't see the world exactly as you do. Somehow, you need to find enough common ground for a real conversation about race. Very few people are stupid or irredeemably mean. They'll listen to what you have to say if they trust you'll listen to what they have to say back." End quote. It's the direct opposite of the kind of culture the internet has fostered, typically focused on calling out racists and shaming them in public. This doesn't work. And as much as it might seem like a lost cause to understand the perspectives of people who may qualify as racist, understanding where they come from is a needed step to being able to speak to them in a way that will help reduce the racial biases they hold. So how do we have a better conversation around these issues, one that can actually reduce people's racial prejudices and anxieties? The first thing to understand is how white Americans, especially in rural areas, hear accusations of racism. While terms like racist, white privilege, and implicit bias intend to point out systemic biases in America, for white Americans, they're often seen as coded slurs. These terms don't signal to them that they're doing something wrong, but that their supposedly racist attitudes, which they would deny having at all, are a justification for lawmakers and other elites to ignore their problems. Imagine, for example, a white man who lost a factory job due to globalization and saw his sister die from a drug overdose due to the opioid epidemic, situations that aren't uncommon today. He tries to complain about his circumstances, but his concerns are downplayed by a politician or racial justice activist who instead points out that, well, look, at least he's doing better than black and brown folks if you look at broad socioeconomic measures. Maybe he does have some level of white privilege, but that doesn't take away from the serious problems he sees in the world today, in his world today. This is how many white Americans, particularly in the working class and rural areas, view the world today. So when they hear politicians and journalists call them racist or remind them about their privilege, they feel like elites are trying to distract from the serious problems in their lives and grant advantages to other groups of people. When Democratic presidential candidate Hillary Clinton called half of Trump voters deplorable, she made this message explicit. Telling people they're racist, sexist, and xenophobic is going to get you exactly nowhere, said Elena Connor. Connor is the executive director of Stanford University's Social Psychological Answers to Real-World Questions Center. It's such a threatening message. One of the things we know from social psychology is when people feel threatened, they can't change. They can't listen. Arlie Hochschild, a sociologist and author of the book Strangers in Their Own Land, Anger and Mourning on the American Right, provided an apt analogy for white rural Americans feeling the neglect. As they see it, they are all waiting in this line toward a hill with prosperity at the top. But over the past few years, globalization and income stagnation have caused the line to stop moving. And from their perspective, people, black and brown Americans, women, are now cutting in the line, because they're getting new and, of course, more equal opportunities through new anti-discrimination laws and policies like affirmative action. One can pick the facts here, particularly since Black and Latino Americans still trail white Americans in terms of wealth, income, and educational attainment. But it is how many white Americans feel regardless of the facts. What's more, accusations of racism can cause white Americans to become incredibly defensive to the point that they might reinforce white supremacy. Robin DiAngelo, who studies race at Westfield State University, described this phenomenon as white fragility in a groundbreaking 2011 paper. Most Americans, white people included, want to think that they're not capable of racism, particularly after the civil rights movement. Overt racism is widely viewed as unacceptable in American society. Yet, racism obviously still exists. And when some white people are confronted with that reality, whether it's accusations of racism against them personally, or more broadly, they immediately become very defensive, even hostile. We need to develop a way to have this conversation that doesn't make some people feel condemned. The innate resistance and defensiveness to conversations about bigotry don't mean that you should never talk about racism, sexism, homophobia, or other kinds of hate, but those conversations may have to be held more tactfully, positioning people into a more receptive position to hear what these problems are all about. One key issue is that people want to feel heard before they can open their minds to other people's points of view. Democrats in particular need to go out of their way to reassure those groups that they're being respected, that they're being listened to, Connor said. That was crucial in Brooklyn Community College transgender canvassing study. In a traditional canvassing session, the canvasser does most of the talking, throwing out all sorts of statistics and reasons the person on the other side of the door should take a specific side on a certain issue. But in the transgender canvassing study, the person getting canvassed often did as much or even more of the talking. As one example, consider an actual conversation from the study as reported by Brian Resnick for Vox. Quote, "In the beginning of their conversation, Virginia asks Gustavo how likely he'd be to support transgender rights legislation. Gustavo says he wouldn't support it because he's worried about predatory men using the law as an opportunity to enter women's bathrooms. Virginia asks why he feels that way. Quote, "I'm from South America, and in South America, we don't like fags," end quote, he tells her. This next moment is crucial. Virginia doesn't jump on Gustavo for the slur, and instead says, "I'm gay," in a friendly manner. Gustavo doesn't recoil. Actually, he becomes more interested. Gustavo and Virginia go on to discuss how much they love their partners, and how that love helps them overcome adversity. Gustavo tells Virginia that his wife is a disabled person. "God gave me the ability to love a disabled person," he says, "and that taking care of one another is why love matters." "That resonates a lot with me," Virginia responds. "For me, these laws, and including transgender people, are about that. They're about how we treat one another." Now that Gustavo is in a place where he's more open, Virginia asks him to imagine what the worst thing could happen if he used a bathroom with a transgender person. He admits he wouldn't be scared. Then comes the breakthrough. "Listen, probably I was mistaken," he says of his original position on trans rights. Virginia asks him again if he'd vote in favor of banning transgender discrimination. "In favor," he says, end quote. Hawkshield shared similar stories in her book. In one example, a woman tells Hawkshield about her love for conservative commentator Rush Limbaugh because he stood up to people, feminists, environmentalists, and other liberals, that she felt belittled her and her lifestyle. As the woman explained, "Oh, liberals think that Bible-believing Southerners are ignorant, backward, rednecks, losers. They think we're racist, sexist, homophobic, and maybe fat." She felt that these accusations overlooked many of the problems that rural white Americans faced, growing up poor, struggling to get a better education, and so on. Because Hawkshield, who's liberal, didn't immediately dismiss the woman's comments and insult her, the two managed to have a frank conversation to reach a better understanding of each other. and the two continued talking as Hochschild wrote her book. From one simple exchange of empathy, it was possible to have more frank conversations. Quote, "You can turn your political alarm system off without jeopardizing who you are and what you believe," end quote, Hochschild told me. "And you can learn something about the person at the other end of the conversation that's going to be of profound importance." These stories from the canvassing study and Hochschild's research demonstrate a key point. People don't want to be immediately dismissed because they might have a view that you consider wrong or even vile. They want to feel heard. And once that happens, it's a lot easier for them to make mental space to understand other people's problems. Actually, having these conversations will be incredibly difficult and time-consuming. Of course, there is a balance to strike here. We can't just ignore the real racial disparities in policing, the criminal justice system, health, wealth, housing, and nearly every other aspect of American life until everyone is ready to talk about these issues openly. We could be waiting forever if we did that. And the work of reducing racial bias can't fall solely on people of color. White Americans need to work within their own communities to combat prejudice. Thankfully, researchers have come up with several ideas that strike the right balance. One approach is to pursue certain policies in a race-neutral manner. For example, equipping police with body cameras has become a prominent idea in response to the police shootings of Black men over the past few years. But the inherent idea behind body cameras doesn't have to be racial. It can just be about generally holding police accountable, no matter whom they're interacting with. And indeed, polls have found that support for body cameras on police officers in general hovers above 90%. But this approach has its limits. Some issues have an explicit racial element to them, so the conversation about these problems has to bring in racism at some point. In the face of resistance, then, actually reducing people's racial anxieties, rather than glossing over them, is necessary. This will require conversations. Maybe it will be through canvassing by activists, much like the transgender study. Maybe churches and schools can take on public education campaigns. Maybe these and other civic institutions can facilitate public forums in which people can openly discuss these problems. But how, exactly, should those conversations and campaigns take form in a way that can meaningfully reduce or eliminate racial prejudice? "We can't pretend we're post-racial because that's absurd," said Rachel Godsill, who is a co-founder and director of research at the Perception Institute. "But we need to work past the idea that our divisions will prevent us from coming together, from solving problems collectively." In The Science of Equality, Godsill and her co-authors proposed several tactics that seem promising, based on research, including presenting people with examples that break stereotypes, asking them to think about people of color as individuals rather than as a group, tasking them with taking on first-person perspectives of people of color, and increasing contact between people of different races. All of these interventions appear to reduce subconscious racial biases, while interracial contact appears most promising for reducing racial anxiety more broadly. Godsill and her team also put forward tactics that can help people limit actions based on racial biases, such as getting people to slow down in their decision-making and teaching them about how subconscious processes can influence their impulses, even on issues unrelated to race, in order to push them to question their own objectivity. So how do you get people to see that diversity isn't a threat to them? Godsill pointed to the transgender canvassing study as one example. Perhaps non-confrontational conversations with people of color, in which both parties share their lived experiences, could go a long way to demonstrating that different racial groups don't have to be at odds. And white Americans could engage in these types of dialogues with other white people to help open their minds to another perspective. The key to these conversations, though, is empathy. And it will take a lot of empathy, not just for one conversation, but many, many conversations in several settings over possibly many years. It won't be easy, but if we want to address some people's deeply entrenched racial attitudes, it may be the only way. That's the end of the article. After I started digging a little deeper to prepare for this talk, I came across an academic study done back in 2011. Ironic effects of anti-prejudice messages. How motivational interventions can reduce, but also increase prejudice. I won't spend any time on this here beyond pointing out that here's some more real research on this topic, and that some well-meaning approaches have in fact been shown to increase prejudice rather than to decrease it. Let's not use those approaches, shall we? Finally, before I wrap up, I wanted to share 2 short clips from a recent episode of the Thinking Atheist podcast with Seth Andrews that discuss an interesting angle I hadn't previously considered. Both of these are from the perspective of Shannon Q. Shannon is a Canadian YouTuber who creates content regarding communication strategy, psychology, and atheist advocacy.
So, coming from a psychological perspective, I spend a lot of time looking at emotional abuse and manipulation. Just something that's interesting to me, especially since I study conversations and dialectic approaches and engagements. And I see a lot of similar tactics, like gaslighting and projection of intention and telling somebody their position and forcing them to defend that position instead of asking them what their position is, imbuing intent. There's a lot of these types of tactics, communication tactics, that mental or emotional abusers and manipulators use that are utilized there. But I think that there's a subset of people, and this may be a small subset of people, but a very loud subset of people that have found a way to excuse their abusive behaviors by attaching them to an agreeable cause. So we would both agree that trans rights are human rights. And I'm absolutely 99% of what you say, 99.9, maybe even 100% of what you say would line up with me. But if I make a slight misstep, then that opens up an opportunity for somebody who has abusive tendencies to abuse me and be rewarded for being abusive.
Yeah.
And that is exceptionally dangerous, and people don't realize that. It's the same sort of tactics that under any other circumstances in a relationship, you would remove yourself from that person. People would tell you to remove yourself from that person. But in this scenario, because the cause that they're attaching their abusive behavior to is one that means something and one that should be championed, that abusive behavior is rewarded because it's seen as a necessity in order to advance that cause, when in fact it's not. It's a detriment because now you're attaching that cause to feelings of abuse by people who may otherwise be allies.
That's an interesting angle, right? If you criticize them for being abusive, they say, well, you're criticizing my worthy cause.
Correct.
Someone who's a bigot or evil would criticize my worthy cause.
It gives them an out for abusive behavior. It gets them in amongst those abuse tactics that I mentioned, those people that engage in those tactics, they're a minority, but a loud one that garners support. In amongst that, well, that is so loud in your face, it's very difficult to discern the legitimate criticism that may be there and requires attention. Like, I'm not perfect. Nobody here is perfect. We've all made mistakes. We've made errors in judgment. We've maybe misspoke. We've had that misstep that Jimmy explained to me what that means now, so I feel better now that I know. And so, like, in amongst that noise is the legitimate criticism from people who are actually trying to get through to you to say, okay, this hurt me. This is why it hurt me. Can you see my perspective? And those voices need to be listened to, but the people that are so busy attacking make it very, very difficult to sift through that noise. And then those people don't feel heard. They feel as though you're ignoring their legitimate criticism and they're not utilizing those tactics. And then they kind of pull towards the people that are using the abuse tactics because they say, well, Shannon doesn't care. I'm trying to tell her this important thing to me, and it seems like she doesn't care. She's more interested in defending herself. So that's frustrating to me too, because I feel as though there's people that I could reach out to and have a conversation with and explain my perspective and maybe learn something from. And maybe, there are opportunities for me to shift my perspective. But I'm losing them because I'm so inundated sometimes by people who aren't interested in having a conversation with me about how I might be able to be better. They're interested in letting everybody know why they should hate me.
Kennedy again. At a time when I thought I was the most radical, I was the most conservative. So, to review, impact matters more than intent. Align your impact with your intent using the best available knowledge. Align your map with the territory. Don't get dragged by the cart. Trot alongside it. It is possible to reduce people's individual racism, but it requires empathy. Lobbing emotionally charged moralistic labels at people is counterproductive, even if true. This is not a burden to place on the victims of oppression. Members of dominant groups should be doing this work within their own groups. Don't be emotionally abusive in the name of a good cause. This is provably counterproductive. Don't tolerate emotional abuse in the name of a good cause. And above all, stay motivated to keep fighting oppression. If you're wondering how on earth you might be able to have some of these seemingly impossible conversations, I highly recommend How to Have Impossible Conversations by Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay, Crucial Conversations, and Nonviolent Communication as a starting place. In conclusion, this issue is too important and too consequential in terms of avoidable human suffering for us not to do the best we can with what we have and what we know. And with that, I'm going to leave it there for today. Thank you.